What's up folks, and welcome to the second part of the video. This is the next section, the assembly of the Amiga Dirty Dozen. As you can see, I've already taken out the original mainspring, which is a little bit worn. So there's a brand new mainspring in the nice clean barrel there, and we're just going to lubricate the hole for the arbor to sit in. So we're going to use a little bit of light grease. Then we use some brass tweezers to refit the arbor into the barrel. And we use brass tweezers here because we don't want to damage or misshapen the spring or cause any damage to the polished steel barrel arbor. And we twist that arbor in place until the hook catches the hole in the end of the mainspring. And then we can add a little bit more grease to the top section of the arbor so that it can move nice and freely when the watch is being wound. So now we can replace the cap on top of the barrel. We're going to try and press that down with the tweezers, just gently, not all the way around. That's what we're going to use the closing tool for. So just get that into position, and then we can flip it over, put it in central to the closing tool, put the lid on, push it down until it snaps nice and with a nice click, and then we know that the barrel's all closed up and ready to go. So we just clean off the barrel with any excess grease or dirt or debris that might be stuck to the barrel. Make sure it's all clean and ready to go into the movement. And now we're going to move on to lubricating the balance jewel and the cap jewel in the main plate. So we're going to remove the balance first. The cap jewel is relatively straightforward. We simply unscrew it from the main plate and we're going to soak it in some epilame for a while before we refit it, and then we're going to move on to the balance cock. The balance cock on this one is non-shock protected, but there's a small circular steel plate that locks the jewel in place, and it's has a beveled edge which engages with three prongs of the jewel setting on the opposite side. I should have taken some photos to make it more clear, so you can see how that works, but some of you out there will probably be more than aware of how these jewels work. Fairly straightforward and simple to remove, clean and refit. But as I said, we're going to start with the cap jewel on the main plate side. It's just a single small screw, and then we're going to take off this little cap jewel, make sure that it's clean before we put it in the epilame. And if it isn't entirely clean or you're not happy with the surface, just use a piece of pegwood here to make sure there's nothing left on the surface. We want a nice clean surface. So what we're doing here is we're putting it in a special jar, and we're removing the pallets and escape wheel from this jar. And this jar has a chemical called epilame, and what the epilame does is it creates a small, very thin layer on whatever you put in it. And whenever you add lubrication to say for example for the cap jewel, the lubrication won't spread, it will want to stay in one place. It's a bit like how the insects on top of ponds skate across the pond. It's from surface tension, so you don't want any oil or lubrication you add to the movement, you don't want it to spread, so you use epilame on certain parts of the movement where you don't want the oil to spread, and that way you get a longer lasting operation of the movement before its next service is required. So we get a fresh piece of Rodico every time I do any of the jewel settings. And we can take that out and we're going to dry it off in this piece of tissue. You can use acid-free paper if you don't want to use tissue. I just use tissue because it's easier and convenient. And because I'm working under magnification, there's no lint or anything stuck to the parts because I can see it, and I also have a compressed air system, so I don't have to worry about any loose fibres. So we're just going to add a little bit of 9010, Mobius 9010. This is a very fine oil and allows the fast movement of parts, so things like balance wheels, escape wheels, train wheels. This is the kind of lubrication that you'd use for cap jewels. It's Mobius 9010. It's a very good lubrication. widely used in nearly all watches. So I'm just going to refit the tiny screw. And we can flip the plate over and make a start on the balance cock. Just checking the jewel holes there for any stuck dirt. So the small plate in the balance cock twists into position a bit like tightening a screw, and you just simply use a large enough driver to fit the slot that's cut out, and then you can push the jewel and the regulator lever out, and then it separates into the 3 separate parts, and then we can give the jewel a clean and also treat the same jewel in epilame again, because we don't want the lubrication to spread. We want it to stay as central to the jewel as we possibly can, which isn't necessarily always the easiest thing to do on a fixed jewel setting like this, but the epilame certainly goes a good way to helping the lubrication stay where we want it to stay. So again, we're just going to make sure there's no hard deposits on the jewel surface. We use a piece of nice clean pegwood, and once I'm happy that that's clean, that can go into the essence jar. Just stuck it there to the Rodico to make sure there's no fibres stuck to the surface. And same as the bottom cap jewel, we're going to use some 9010 in the balance cap jewel as well. Nice, easy, free running lubrication. Depending on the oiler size that you use, it depends on how much of that oil you're going to pick up. And I'm using a small oiler here, so I didn't pick up quite as much oil as I needed. So I've gone back a couple of times. But underneath the loop, I can see that the globule of oil is a singular mass. It's not spread out all over the place. It's one singular mass of oil. And then what we do is put the regulator down, put the jewel down, and then we can set the cock on top of the jewel setting, and we can place that beveled steel plate inside and screw it all together. And once that's screwed in place, that pulls the jewel towards the cock, and it's all done. On most ordinary balance cocks, you'll find 2 screws that hold the jewel setting in place, but Omega have designed this system, which is a little bit easier, if I'm honest, than the 2 screws version, because quite often the small screws end up getting scarred or threaded. So this is quite a good system from Omega. So now we're going to refit the balance wheel, and this is a Breguet spring, so the regulator pins are wide open. Once I've got the stud in position, the spring should nice and easily find its way in between the regulator pins. If it hasn't, then I'll adjust that once it's in the main plate. So I'm not quite sure that the stud's gone into position, so I'm using a very fine oiler just to be very, very careful, very gentle in persuading it into the hole before we tighten down the stud. And the stud screw is quite small, so I'm using a 0.6mm driver there to slowly and gently close that screw down. Whenever working with a balance on any watch, you should always take care and take your time. There's absolutely no rush. It's a very delicate part of any watch, so you don't want to rush this stage. And we're going to gently place it back in the main plate and check that it swings nice. not pressing too hard down on the plates there. We don't want to mark them, so we're going to move over and use the brass tweezers as we press the cock down in position. Quickly jerking the movement to make sure that the balance wheel is free. It's very easy to break the balance pivots on these types of movement if you're not careful. Shock protected movements are a little more forgiving because the shock spring can move if the pivot isn't in the correct place. But these types of movements where there is no shock protection, the pivots are easily broken. So it's always worth making sure. So we're just using a little hand blower there just to gently persuade the balance to move. And I can see there's nice free movement there. And then we can move on to the assembly of the rest of the movement. So we're going to start off with the train wheels. So that's the escape wheel, the fourth wheel with the sub-seconds pinion, the third wheel and the center wheel. And we can place them into the plates and then use the train bridge to complete that. And again, with the train wheels, we've got to take great care. Some of these pivots are very fine, especially on the escape wheel, and we've got to pay attention to the sub-second pinion that protrudes from this wheel as well, because they're all very easy to break, so you've got to take great care whenever fitting these wheels. So with the centre wheel, I like to add a little touch of lubrication where the centre wheel meets the bearing in the centre. Because this is a position that you can't really lubricate once the wheel is in position, although you could lubricate it from the dial side. I find it easier to do it before the wheel actually goes in. Just checking the jewel holes of the train plate. Make sure they're all clean, nothing untoward's going on there. So we're just going to very gently locate the plate in the right position. Once we're happy it's in position, we can press the plate down, constantly checking the free movement of the wheels. And then we're going to fit the screws. But we're not going to tighten the screws all the way down. We're going to tighten them just until they bite at the bottom of their thread. And once everything is in position and we're happy that all the pinions are in the correct place, then you can tighten down all of the screws to the correct torsion. If you go too soon, you could end up breaking a pivot, so you just want to make sure that the train wheels are nice and free to move. There seems to be no problems there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to fit the barrel. We're going to lubricate the bottom and the top of the barrel arbor. There's no jewel holes here, so we're using a relatively thick oil. I'm using D4 oil here to lubricate this the barrel arbor. And then we're going to use the barrel bridge, the ratchet wheel, the crown wheel. The crown wheel's 2 screws, and then we can flip it over and make a start on the keyless works. So again, take care when fitting any bridges, make sure everything's in the correct position before we screw down a plate, because we don't want to damage any of the pivots, and that includes the centre wheel pivot as well. It is thicker, it is stronger, it's less likely to break, but it does always help to pay attention no matter what part you're working on. I'm just gently going to coax the barrel to see that all the train wheels move and there's no problems there, so we can fit the screws and the other components. Apologies for any close-ups of my head in the shot. It's not an easy thing to video movement services without getting my head somewhere in the shot. So we can just loosely fit the screws into the plate. Although they always seem to want to try and escape. And again, at this point, all of the screws are only just closed down. They're not fully tightened, but they're certainly tightened down enough to hold the plate in place. And then once I'm happy that everything moves freely, I'll tighten down all the screws to the correct amount. So we're fitting the ratchet wheel here. We're going to use the pegwood to position it. We don't want to use the steel tweezers on the surface of the ratchet wheel, because the ratchet wheel has a pattern, a brushed pattern on it, so we don't want to scratch that up. And then we secure the screw down using the appropriate size driver. Give it a couple of clicks and we can see that the wheels all move. And now that I'm happy all the wheels are free to move, I'm just tightening down the screws. So now we're going to move on to fitting the crown wheel core, and the two screws that secure the core down against the crown wheel. Now on other movements, the setting lever bolt would be placed down first before the barrel bridge, but in this particular movement the setting bolt itself is actually a straight through bolt, so it can be screwed in after the plate is in position. But in most instances, in most manually wound watches, the setting bolt is a shouldered screw and is held down in place by the barrel bridge. But like I said, in this particular case, that doesn't matter, because this is a different design. So we've added a little touch of lubrication to two places, a good amount of grease, not an oil here, we're going to use a grease, and then again on the inside so that the crown core allows that wheel to move nice and freely. Just gently put it in position, and then we can pop the two small screws in. And again, we're just going to turn the ratchet a couple of turns just to make sure that all of the wheels, including the now fitted crown wheel, all turn nicely, and they do. So we can now move on to the next stage. We're going to start by fitting different parts of the keyless works. So we're going to start off with the cannon pinion. We've already lubricated the center wheel pinion there, a little touch of grease, and then we're going to push down on the cannon pinion. Make sure that's all the way down. Usually get a nice click feel go through the tweezers, and you know it's in the correct place. Make sure it's flat. And then what we're going to fit is the clutch wheel or castle wheel, depending on how old you are, I guess. I call them the clutch wheel, but I know they are also known as a clutch wheel. And there's a winding pinion fitted there, and we're just going to lubricate the stem. We're going to add a little touch of grease to the appropriate places before we fit in the stem. Apologies about the camera, it does get a bit blurry from time to time. It's using the original lens that come with the camera, and sometimes it doesn't always want to play ball. It wasn't quite sure what it wanted to focus on there. So we've got the stem in there. then we just add a touch of lubrication to the clutch wheel or the castle wheel and the winding pinion. And we're going to add a bit of grease to the plate where the setting lever sits. That's the setting lever and not the setting lever spring. There are two different components. They share a very similar name, but they are two different components. And this setting lever is what engages in the cutout of the stem, allowing you to set the time and wind the watch. And as I mentioned, with this particular movement, the setting bolt itself is a straight through bolt, so it can go straight through the plate. We're going to hold that setting lever in place whilst we try and get this bolt to go in. It's quite a thick, fat bolt, so it's quite hard to break the actual bolt itself, but the threaded section is quite delicate. So we're just going to screw that down. Not going to go full force, but certainly until we've got the lever secure on the other side. Now we've fitted the yoke and the yoke spring, and a little bit of lubrication for the minute wheel post and the setting wheel post. And I forget that the minute wheel doesn't have any cutouts to lubricate the jewel there, so I take the minute wheel back off and lubricate it before I put the minute wheel in position, as you'll see. So now we're going to fit the minute wheel. We're going to fit the setting lever spring. We're going to secure that down with a piece of pegwood whilst we put the bolt in place. Just a single screw to hold down this setting lever spring. And we screw it down fairly tight, but not all the way. And then we can push the spring in position. And then we can tighten the screw off. So we just use a little bit of Rodico to take away any of the excess lube. We don't want too much grease open and exposed, because that tends to attract any dust or fine particles. Even once the watch is assembled, excess grease can attract all sorts of dirt. So we just have that away with Rodico. Now we're going to move on to fitting the pallets and the balance. And hopefully we'll have a working watch once again. So we're going to lubricate the pallet stones. Everybody does this differently. Some people like to lubricate the pallet stones once they're in position. Some people like to lubricate the escape wheel. Everybody does it different. I like to lubricate the pallet stones before they go in, and then check the escapement later on. So underneath the loop, although I can't really show it on camera because it is a very, very small area to try and video, is adding just a very tiny amount, probably 1/4 of the width of the stone of lubricant. This is 915 Mobius grease, I think is the number of the grease. It's a very fine grease, a bit like 9010, but instead of being a liquid, it's like a grease, a very, very thin grease. And you apply that to the pallet stones to help keep the watch lubricated and keep it running. You should always take care when fitting the pallet cock, because there is a pallet staff and the pivots on the pallet staff are very delicate. So we want to make sure that the pallets are in the correct position before we add the screws and tighten it down. So you can use a piece of pegwood if you might want to, just to keep the pallet cock in position whilst you initialize one of the screws. It'll give you a couple of turns on the stem to wind a little bit of power into the mainspring. And the first thing that you're looking for is for the pallets to move to one side or another. And then just give a little clean around the area with some Rodico. Then we're going to give a couple more turns on the mainspring, get some power in there before we fit the balance. Now the pallet's in position, we can check the cannon pinion is tight enough. And now we can fit the balance. And again, we want to take care when fitting the balance. We want to make sure that we don't trap the hairspring. So we've got to put the balance in at a slight angle, and we can do that by tilting the movement and tilting the balance and sort of slipping it underneath. So we've got to make sure we've got the location of the pallets in the correct position so that we can get the balance in. Now we see the movement comes to life. We've just got to get the cock in the correct position. Again, taking great care not to break the pivots on the balance. Using the brass tweezers there so as not to mark the balance cock. I don't seem to have much luck with these brass tweezers when it comes to holding the screws. The pesky little blighter wants to keep running away. So we get that in position, and we can screw it down. And when we screw down the balance cock, we do it quite carefully. Make sure that the balance remains engaged all the time that we're screwing it down. And that is the movement now completely assembled. So we've just got to do any final checks and add the lubricant to the exposed jewels. Then we can move on to the next section. So we give it a bit more of a wind. Everything seems to be okay. The cannon pinions seems tight enough. The balance is swinging freely. So we're just going to lubricate the jewels off camera, and we'll move on to the next section. So now we're going to fit the dial and hands, and we fit the hour wheel. Now the dial has been protected in this acid-free paper, so there won't be any dust or any scratches to the dial. Always protect the dial when you remove it from the watch. And there are two screws that secure the dial, so we're just going to tighten those down. This is a 0.8mm driver, which I don't think is big enough, or no, it seems to be fine. So now we're going to fit the hands. We'll start with the sub-seconds hand. And the tweezers I'm using here are the mirror polished tweezers, so the surface is mirror polished on the actual tweezers themselves, and this reduces the risk of any scratching or damage to the hands and also to the dial. And then we're just going to use the shop-made brass tool for fitting the sub-seconds there. And then we're going to move onto the hour hand. Now the hour hand, when you put the hour hand on, you can place that almost anywhere on the watch because it's the first hand. But we place it close to 12. And this is a version hand setting tool. Pick the appropriate sized stake. And we carefully apply pressure to the hour hand until it fits down to the correct depth, and we make sure that it's flat and true to the dial. Before we move on to the minute hand. So I'll swap the stake for the hand fitting tool to a slightly smaller stake. Make sure we fit the hand in the correct direction, not upside down. Make sure the hands are all lined up. Always worth taking your time with this. And we use the staking tool again to push the hat down to the correct depth and make sure it's flat and level to the hour hand and the dial. Just swapping out for a slightly smaller stake. So the hand is in the correct position. I just moved it accidentally with the stem. We moved the hands round, checking the position of the hands. And now the movement is ready to be recased. Just checking the hand position for any surface dirt. So now we're going to remove the stem so that we can fit it into the case. We'll loosen the bolt off a little bit, not all the way, just enough so that the stem can come out. So not quite enough there, so we give it a little bit more. And the stem pops out nice and easy. So we use a blast of the compressed air. Make sure there's no loose dust or debris in the case or in the or on top of the movement or on the dial. And then we can just pop the case over on top of the movement there, and we can flip the cushion over, and then we can fit the stem in position and the movement retainer. Gently coax the stem in position. Fit the movement retainer so that it keeps it in position, and then we can tighten that setting bolt back down again. Pull the stem out, put it back in, push it out. Do that a couple of times and then fully tighten down the setting bolt. Sometimes it's not fully secure, so I always suggest pulling it out, pushing it in a couple of times. You can fit the case back on. Find the threads. Check the hand setting. And that is pretty much the watch complete. So the only thing we're left to do is to test the watch, make sure that the timing's okay. We're going to fit the strap, but that's pretty much it. That's how this watch is serviced. Now obviously not all of the footage that I've taken has been included in the video. I've had to shorten it so that the video is a watchable length, but hopefully you'll get an idea of how it's done. Relatively straightforward kind of service, but care should be taken even on simple watches. And there it is, ready to go back home, so to speak. And it should be good for another 5-6 years before it needs another service yet again, if it's used daily. Very nice little watch, great little watch, one of the dirty dozen. I personally prefer the Jaeger, but the Amigas are quite nice too. Thanks for watching.